I have several times reformulated what I wanted to say. And part of the reason for that was that I thought that I would learn an awful lot from the conference and wanted to be able to react a little bit to what I heard. I think that's why I ended with the idea of talking about an integration of the phenomenological efforts towards founding the social sciences, and with wanting to discuss Schutz's account of Husserl's idea, Volume 2, in a Steinian way. So I want to do that because I think, of course, that Stein's phenomenology of the social has a lot to contribute, and I think it would be a pity if we could not open up the Schutzian tradition to those insights by discussing them, of course. And of course, what we've seen in this conference, and from having looked at the manuscripts that go before Ideas 2, is that, especially as Julia showed, with the emphasis on values in what I'm going to call now, for better or for worse, Stein's Ideas 2, just to distinguish them from what will be published as Husserl's Ideas 2, namely the manuscripte, or the manuscripts that lay in front of Stein as she made this patchwork, which reflects her own evolving understanding of transcendental phenomenology. So Schutz, this account that he gives of Ideas 2, which you find in Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, and I used the version that's in the collected papers 3. The advantage of his paper is that it's very clear, and it's also written by somebody who thought that it was one work, and therefore that a resume of it was a real possibility. It's also a very influential account. So some kind of engagement, a Steinian engagement with how what it says would allow us maybe to see again, because Valentina, for example, has also pointed very much to this concept of life force, as has indeed also Angela. So you will see some of the things recurring here again. So what I'll do is that I'll read some passages from its account of the main argument of Ideas 2, and that will allow us to compare some of its ideas, which I'll put in red, with corresponding ones from Stein's Zum Problem der Einfühlung und Beiträge, which I'll put in gold. Then I will have Savicki's diagnosis of Stein's Ideas 2. Well, yeah, Stein's Ideas 2. And I will also discuss that diagnosis in the light of the new edition of Husserl's Ideas 2, which I will have to confess I haven't been able to look at in great detail, so I'll have to rely on something of what other people have said. And I'll do that in order to ask whether this diagnosis was the one Stein herself made of Husserl's Ideas 2, so of the manuscript that lay in front of her, and which led her to propose her own consistent part version of the same project in Beiträge. So first, passages from Schutz's Ideas, Volume 2, referring, of course, to the old version, that is, to Stein's Ideas 2. He states what is also stated in Ideas 1, and it's reiterated in Stein's autobiography, Aus dem Leben einer jüdischen Familie, as the reason for why Stein wanted to work on empathy, should says the following of the whole task of ideas. The problem of constitution has to be solved for all material regions, that of material, of animal nature, and of the spirit. But these intentional analyses of the objectivities of the various regions are interlaced. The inanimate thing is not anything isolated over against the experiencing subject. It's an intersubjectively identical thing, constitutive unity of a higher order, related to an indefinite plurality of subjects that stand in a relation of mutual understanding. The intersubjective world as the correlate of intersubjective experiences, mediated through empathy, plays a constitutive part in objective experience. So, this being the reason why Stein wanted to concentrate in her doctoral work on the problem of empathy, also, I think, explains why she concentrates in her ideas too on the constitution of animal nature. It seems to be where she has most personally contributed to that volume. And that's because I think she thought when she came to these manuscripts, well, I've already done that. I can just apply what I've already done. And of course, Husserl gave me summa cum laude, so he must have understood, and he must have thought that it was worthwhile. Of course, George's comment that he declined to publish on the problem of empathy in the Jahrbuch because it preempted something that he himself had said in Ideas 2 is interesting. I had completely forgotten that remark. I suppose you took it from Aus dem Leben einer jüdischen Familie. But that could maybe also explain why he, in reading on the problem of empathy, sort of had a kind of déjà vu. I think we're dealing with people who are thinking so closely to each other that they actually find it hard to accept that the other is another, because their thoughts are so they become each other's enemies because they can't quite disentangle themselves. They come to enemies is not the right word, but they come to disagree about things that they think that the other is saying, but it's actually themselves that's been saying it. Of course, for Stein, the problem of phenomenology, or the enterprise of phenomenology, was conceived as an intersubjective one, so as one to which you contributed. In principle, that's the case for Husserl too, but in practice, he seems maybe to be less able to accommodate the contribution of others. At least that is quite likely how Stein experienced it. So she thought she had described in the problem of empathy, chapter 3, called the constitution of the psychophysical individual, that is the constitution of animal nature, or it is really, or the individual as psychophysical. She described it as part of the analysis of those entities, namely the psychophysical individual and the person, for the constitution of which empathy is indispensable. So that's why she dealt with it at all. It was because those two entities, the psychophysical individual, the animal, and the person, both could not be constituted, could not be identified without the act of empathy. So that's why she wants to deal with those things in the first place. And therein, on the problem of empathy, she moved from constitutional analysis of the pure I over the stream of consciousness, the soul, and the living body, to the constitution of the foreign I, whose 0 point of orientation finally allows me, by means of empathy, to learn to see my living body as a physical body like others. So you can see she takes the point of departure in the pure I through to phenomenological method as she understands it, and she constitutes from within this experience, from within transcendental experience, the stream of consciousness. That is, she identifies how it is identified by the I, as well as the soul and the living body in great detail. And then she transfers to the foreign I, whom I get to experience in the act of empathy, and by means of whose zero point of orientation, I then can see myself through reiterated empathy as someone, as a body, as someone experiencing who is also expressive through his or, well, in my case, her body. Now, constitution is for Stein, and that's maybe also one of the things that makes the big difference. I think it may be even, I think it's probably a very big difference, actually. Constitution is motivated for Stein. That means it's not, well, it's also, you can say for Husserl, principle, maybe. So we constitute things because they're valuable to us in one way or another. We get the whiff of their value, and then we see them. Well, their value is part of the full constitution of the object. Hence, I think that's also not the solution, but I think it's an important part of a response to Tony. The person is valuable. That's why I constitute myself as a person. I don't have to. I can not do it. It's perfectly possible, and it may even, if there is a good reason, be advisable. Now, I'm not sure I could see you coming up with very good reasons for not doing it. I think, in fact, the contrary. I think we can only, as persons, be responsible in relation to governmentality. But maybe I didn't understand your point completely. Anyway, in this chapter 3, which is the second chapter on the problem of empathy, Stein then considers how in reiterated empathy I modify my view of the world and of myself, and thus accede to the socially constructed world and to the intersubjectively constituted self. So all this, Stein comes with this as a package to ideas 2, and she is impatient, as you, Julia, so very sensibly said, with having heard all this from Husserl, having learned it all. Why can't he just think it together? Why has he got such a difficulty when she served it all for him? Why can't he just do what she did? But nobody ever can. And that may be where she's also relatively, well, she's not that young, but it is hard that everyone has to think their own way through things. But I think in that sense, she had to resign. She had to leave him to his own devices, so to speak, to find a way for himself. She could not, she thought she could provide it, but insofar as the work was his, he couldn't accept it as hers. And that does make sense. It may be not the best way of collaborating, except if you understand it as a collaborative work. And that's Husserl never probably did. And then possibly you shouldn't confide your notes to someone else. It's too involved a work. It's too difficult. You can't. In fact, this kind of work can't be done by obedience. It's just not. Also, well, Stein thought that he actually hadn't got the distinction between motivation as psychic causality, as I'll show in a little second, which would have allowed him to understand how the social world is conjugated, how intersubjectivity itself is conjugated. I'll come back to that. Now, in contrast to this, to Stein's understanding of a constitutional analysis beginning with the I, Husserl's presentation of ideas 2 has its analysis begin with the objective identification of the psyche in the animal. And Sarah actually showed that very well, that was the end point also in the Cartesian meditations. The body is somehow by Husserl understood as a part and parcel of the starting point. That is not the case for Stein. The body is constituted, and it is constituted, and again, but of course it's valuable to constitute it, but sometimes it's not. And you can think of people who live with chronic pain, for example. They have advantage in learning how to unconstitute certain types of their body, such that the pain is gone with it, so to speak. It's a management tool of the body to learn to pay no attention to it, and that has been used by all traditions of asceticism throughout the world. Anyway, so this analysis in Husserl's ideas 2 begin with the objective identification of the psyche in the animal, to whom the psyche is then attributed, thus apparently bypassing the constitution of the psyche itself, that is from within experience, and also that of the body. So it says this: a soul or psyche is predicated to the animalia, which also include human beings. Psyche is from the outset always incarnated, and that means that it appears as an element of nature in connection with a material thing, the animal or human body. In order to investigate the constitution of the realm of nature as psyche, not psyche as nature, but nature as psyche, we have to analyze our originary intuition of the psyche, which precedes all theoretical thinking and which no theory can invalidate. And that's indeed exactly what Stein wants to do in psychic causality. So the first part of Beiträge, which has to be read in conjunction with individual and community, or rather, more importantly, individual and community has to be read in relation to psychic causality. They form two parts of the same work, because you can't actually understand the structure of individual and community unless you understand this distinction between motivation and psychic causality that she's developing in the first volume or part. So this work, which is the first she writes immediately after taking her leave, so it's the one that she thinks has to get out of her system. This is what Husserl should have said, but didn't. So now she has to say it for transcendental phenomenology to survive as a project. I think that's really how I understand her motivation. She cares so much about this that she has to contradict the master. And this is what she says. Well, I don't have a quotation here. She tries to show that the psyche is constituted from noetic contents of acts, marked by the fluctuation of life power. So that's what allows us to know that we have a psyche, know that we are psychic, that we experience life power, the fluctuation of life power, rather. The psyche is constituted as the mechanism that vitality is replenished from positive experiences and depleted from negative ones. It's experienced originarily in myself, in my stream of consciousness. I notice the waxing and waning of life power as among my experiences, or as a thread throughout my experiencing, and that I also notice by means of empathy in the other. Psychic causality is a proceeding phenomenology, phenomenally distinct from motivation, and by no means, therefore, a feature of subjectivity as such. And here also, there is a distinction, I think, with Husserl. He seems less able than Stein to imagine a non-bodily subject or a non-psychic subject. To her, it becomes important that psychic causality is a feature, or life power is a feature of a particular kind of subjectivity, one which is not pure spiritual motivatedness, but which is characterized by the waxing and waning of life power manifesting in drives, strivings, and attitudes. The type of subjectivity also experiences the values also experienced by the pure spiritual motivatedness, but as in value feeling, not in sentiment, which has the whole psyche as its amplification chamber, and therefore can play a lot of tricks on us. Sentient subjectivity experiences the values as motivating powers contributing to its life power economy, whereas spiritual persons, purely spiritual persons who are not also psychophysical individuals like human beings, they have direct intuition of the motivating power of values. And thus she comes up with what constitutes the proper object of psychology, namely the psyche, as constituted from psychic causality, or all those elements of all those acts that are marked by life power, by the fluctuations of life power. I think I don't have to formulate it as a question anymore, but what it has made clear to me, especially from Sarah's presentation, from the Cartesian meditations, there is an ideas too, also as portrayed by Schutz, a tendency towards identifying consciousness with the psyche, instead of identifying the latter by means of the markers of psychic causality and life power. And that means that the object of psychology is less well identified, as Stein would see it, than in her Beiträge. As also the object of the humanities are less well identified, namely as Geist, which, as Stein sees it, can't really be understood in its purity unless you subtract the psyche. Pure motivatedness is so frequently blurred by all the psychic features of our experience, such that we frequently don't know what we are experiencing, because our psyche is such a complicated space in which to move. Now, I think what I want to say is that if you counteract this tendency of identifying consciousness with the psyche, without the possibility of there being a purely spiritual standpoint, if I can put it like that, purely spiritual person, without distinguishing the psyche from the person, basically, then you can move to integrate the constitution of the human being that Stein develops in Aufbau der menschlichen Person, together with the eidetic analysis, which completes it. Further, Schutz says, within this absolute stream of consciousness, certain unifying formations enter into existence, which are, however, entirely different from the unity of the real I and its qualities. To these formations belong, for instance, the lasting opinions. I think this is what makes people say that already Ideas 2 has genetic phenomenology in it. And so these lasting opinions of one and the same subject, which could be called habitual ones if this term did not lead to dangerous confusion with the current use of habits emanating from dispositions which belong to the I-man, the empirical human being. These lasting opinions or convictions become the possession of the pure ego. So they are part of the transcendental sphere. Obviously, they're not part of the real ego. Always subject, of course, to modification, correction, corroboration, or annihilation by supervening experiences. So these lasting opinions, now I can't see what's up there. Which can for Stein be understood to be belief or existential value judgment, or belief based on existential value judgments. They characterizes the existence of the subject as having this or that worldview, as she sees it. But belief is for Stein a spiritual or existential rather than a psychological matter. And here you can see the distinction she has between the spiritual and the psychic is quite important for understanding what even sedimentation of belief would mean, and for integration of the psychic and the existential dimensions of the human being. The sedimentation of belief, that is the habitual belief in, for example, the existence of the world, God, Marxism, or some person, including myself, is, however, a psychological question to the extent that beliefs are placeholders for consciously made judgments. And in this function are energy-saving devices. Insofar as it consumes belief, it consumes less life power to believe than to retrace the steps of consciously motivated judgments. Sometimes it does take a lot of life power to believe, but usually it takes more to retrace the steps of consciously motivated judgments, which is why it is a preferred option, but not always. The existential subject in relation to its beliefs reveals an a priori moral or valent character, personality. If the person also is a psychophysical individual, its beliefs are habitual, may be habitual, and may thereby be conditioned by things apart from value judgments. And that's why beliefs or lasting opinions also is of consequence for social causality, what I will call social causality. It's not actually a term Stein uses, but it would make sense that would, just like psychic causality founds psychology, social causality would be that which is studied by the social sciences. Now, that is part of what is studied. Beliefs are part of what is studied by the social sciences, insofar as, or because they can be transferred by what Stein calls psychic contagion. And that, of course, is not her own concept, but she's not the only one who talks psychic contagion. But what is important in what I'm going to say here is this conjugation of intersubjectivity that my beliefs it's not that they are motivated they are motivated in different manners, but they are also, some of them had not at all because I want them or because I have decided to have them, but because they have been transferred to me by psychic contagion. I have adopted them through by a transfer of psychic life power. Because it saves me energy, and usually this happens without me being aware of it. I come to take over this opinion because it's just what everybody believes, it's what everybody says, and that's, well, it's much easier to believe what everybody says than not. I can also consciously adopt beliefs in my surroundings because that is easier, but that's different from taking them over by psychic contagion. That involves a choice. Or because I can also do it because I want to form part of the group that holds them. So we're still talking about choice. I can come by this process to share life power and form part of a we, because that is what makes up a we for Stein. As far as I can see, that there is a sharing of life power. Even as I can also come to form part of it for spiritual reasons, that is, my personality structure, because I access the values that are the values of this spiritual community. Now, individual and community is a work about how this differentiation can be shown from within phenomenologically reduced experience. So, in a sense, that's the differentiation of the Gemeingeist, which, if I understood Emanuela's contribution right, it would were developed by Husserl maybe after his discussion with Stein, and you can I would imagine that she must have written this because she said this is lacking in ideas 2. I have to contribute this conjugation of the structure of intersubjectivity. Otherwise, we can't understand how communities are formed, scientific or otherwise. The scientific community is, of course, not the only type of community possible, nor the only we possible. So Schutz goes on to say that as the material clings to unity of its qualities, so is the psyche the unity of its qualities, founded upon but not identical with the underlying sensorial faculties. These qualities are organized in a particular hierarchy, and this unity, and nothing else, is the psyche. The psyche is a unity of the stream of consciousness as the life of an identical I, of a unity extended in time. It seems we here see examples of the tendency to identify psyche with the objectivation of the subject, as well as of a non-differentiation of psychic and spiritual aspects of consciousness. Furthermore, the psyche is always incarnated in the body, and the problem of the constitution of this body as an animated one, not as a mere spatial object among other spatial objects, in the experience of the subject now has to be investigated. Have we here the idea of an a priori link between psyche and body? I think maybe with Sarah's presentation, yeah, we do, such that the constitutional analysis of the body amounts to a constitutional analysis of the psyche. Not so for Stein. Although they are linked, they're not immediately linked. Again, the tendency to identify psyche with the objectivation of the subject seems expressed. So,
Mette, maybe just a few more minutes.
Yeah, okay. Very good. So Savick's diagnosis is the following. This troubled text pursues two distinct and utterly incompatible strategies to solve the problem that it means to address, establishing a single foundation for the natural and cultural sciences. One solution found signs and the immediate intuitions available to living animals, to animal bodies, such as our own. Bodily life is intrinsically empathized in the ablative sense, that is, it can be empathized also in my own case, and therefore empathizable in the accusative sense, can be empathized in others. So bodies are empathizable. As such, bodily life is logically prior to the plurality of living bodies, the location of eyes in them, the individuation of those eyes, investment of my own eye in a body, the spatio-temporal structure of the natural world, the motivational structure of cultural expressions, and the possibility of registering world influences immediately, or personal influences immediately. This solution does away with the need to show how mind and matter connect simply by choosing to begin its analysis at a point prior to the alienation of body and mind. Proposes that the absolute science to found all others will be a cultural science that will show the derivative character of the natural sciences. Savicki's point, I think, is that, well, it seems to me that she thinks that this is Stein's option, but I don't think that's true. I think it is very much Husserl's. The other one is that of transcendental phenomenology. The other solution founds the sciences in the object constitution carried out by transcendental subjectivity. Instead of starting with bodily life, this account starts with the constitution of such things as live bodies. Constitution is the unification of a series of adumbrated appearances into a thing intended as being what it is on its own. Constitution is logically prior to what is constituted, spatio-temporal world with individual bodies and causal relations, my body, other bodies like mine, ideal essential laws, the inner world with temporary regulated streams of experience pooling up into discrete unities, and the possibilities of other eyes who would be constituting all of this just as I do. The second solution distinguishes between causality, which operates throughout material nature as a feature of its constitution, and motivation, which operates within the intellect and can be replicated by other intellects. According to this second solution, the absolute science will be phenomenology, the science of transcendental subjectivity. So, my point is very simply, it seems to me that that is what Stein wants to contribute with, and actually the reason why she resigns. Thank you for your attention.